Today I'm going to be talking about HTMX um, and how it's being used in Apostrophe and how you might want to use it in Apostrophe. First off, what is HTMX? So it's a small dependency-free JavaScript library that allows you to access modern browser features directly in your markup. I'm going to be primarily almost exclusively talking about Ajax today and how HTMX gives you easy access to that. But it also can power CSS transitions, WebSockets, and server-sent events directly in HTML, all using attributes that just are added right to your markup. So basically, it delivers powerful and progressive page enhancement without having to write JavaScript to provide that functionality. So just going to switch. So late last year, we released a blog article. It was written by a talented community contributor, Antonella, about how HTMX can be used to enhance the Apostrophe CMS blog extension. So I'll be referring back to this article a bit through the talk, and I really encourage you to give it a read. It's going to go into some more details on some things that I'll mention today. So it's worth having a look at. I'm just gonna pop that link into the chat, so if you want to grab it, you can. So this talk is meant to be a pretty high-level overview of HTMX and how you may want to use it with your Apostrophe CMS project. I'm not going to get deep into the weeds and a lot of details, but more just give you an overview. So since the blog article has covered how to enhance your project by powering infinite scroll and in-page filtering using Apostrophe, built-in server-side rendering to deliver piece content, I'm going to look at a slightly different use case. After a quick intro to what HTMX is, I'm going to build out a way that you can grab images from an outside API and display them on your page, and go into a little bit of the caveats of what you have to think about when using HTMX. Jump back to my slides here. So at the core, what HTMX delivers to you is a way to access many of the standard HTTP request methods like GET or POST. And all you have to do in order to access those is just go ahead and add them right onto an attribute with the API URL as value. So for example, here we have a button. It's going to, when clicked, fire a post request to the following endpoint. So this should look pretty familiar to you if you're used to dealing with the Apostrophe CMS REST API. So API v1 products by, that route is going to trigger some action for us when this button is clicked. So when this request occurs is determined by triggers. So by default, what element you put the HX post or put or get or whatever onto, by default, those are going to be triggered by some browser events, some JavaScript browser events. So for input, text area, and select elements, that's going to be triggered by change. For form elements, that's going to be triggered by submit. And anything else like a span or a div, it's going to be triggered, or a button for that matter, are going to be triggered by click. But HTMX doesn't leave you sort of stranded with just these limited number of triggers. There's also the HX trigger attribute that can be added onto your element. When you add that element on, you can then pass in various different browser events in order to trigger. So in this first example, we're going to fire off a post event to the API endpoint mouse entered when the mouse actually enters into that div area. So this is just a standard browser event. This trigger is pretty powerful. It also allows other actions. So in the next example down, we have a div with a get request that's going to fire. And it has this little notation here in square brackets after the click. And that's basically just a Boolean expression. A JavaScript expression that's going to evaluate on the event. So in this case, it's going to fire when the user clicks on the event and at the same time has the control key depressed. So that's just checking for event.control key to be equal to true. And then if we go one more down, we see that you can also pass in global methods. So this is just a JavaScript method that would check the global state. And if it returns back true, again, you would get the event triggered. In this case, a get to the clicked endpoint. So there's also other trigger modifiers. So we can see how we can respond to an event, but you can also modify this. So one trigger modifier that gets used often is once. So if you add this on, you're only going to fire that request, that AJAX request, once. So it doesn't matter if the user clicks multiple times, it's only going to happen once. And then there's some other ones that are pretty interesting that allow you to really have fine control over when a particular event is going to occur. There's also some special events. So one special event that's used quite often is load. So this is a little bit different than the load event you might be thinking about. This only fires when that particular element that the request is on is first loaded. So it's a way to trigger things when your new templating, your payload from your response is first coming onto the page. Two other good ones are revealed and intersect. So these basically allow you to fire the fire the request only when something's going to scroll into the viewpoint or scroll a certain distance into the viewpoint. So that's a really powerful method, and you don't have to add any other JavaScript library to avail yourself of this. One last thing to mention with modifying how the request trigger fires off is something called polling. And pretty much the only method in polling is every, and that takes a unit of time. So in this example here at the bottom, you've got a GET request that's going to fire hitting the image API endpoint, and that trigger is going to occur when the element is first loaded, but then it's going to occur again every 30 seconds. And so what that's going to end up doing is allowing you to basically infinitely scroll or update your the content in that particular image every 30 seconds. So that's also a pretty great thing to be able to do without having to write much JavaScript. Speaking of targeting, so far what I've spoken about is the default, where HTMX is going to target the element making the request for any further manipulation, but you can use hx-target attribute, and that can take both regular and extended CSS selectors. So for example, we'll see you can pass in something like hash results, and what that will do is it will find the element on the page with an ID of result and go ahead and manipulate the contents of that DOM node. It also takes these extended selectors, so you could pass in something like closest form or next image to be able to manipulate other elements on the page pretty easily. So again, AJAX is all about being able to update your page with new content without doing a full refresh. And we've seen already how HTMX you can pass in a target, you can pass in a trigger to cause that DOM update. The last thing is the HX swap attribute. So what this does is it tells HTMX how the particular DOM node that you've targeted should be manipulated. So if you have something like I talked about where you have a div with an ID of result, you can then pass in inner HTML as the swap attribute value, HX swap attribute value. And what that will do is it will leave that outer div alone and only replace the inner content of that particular node. And then, so you've got other things you can do. You can swap the outer HTML, which will completely replace the entire node, including the wrapper. You can append or prepend DOM content to a particular target. So the other thing that when you fire a request that happens is that HTMX is going to change out classes on the existing target and the DOM content that's loaded in after the request comes back. So HTMX is going to add the HTMX request class to the target when the request first fires. You can actually modify this by adding an HX indicator attribute to target some other element on the page for that class change. When the response finally lands, this is changed to HTML swapping. And you can set a delay on this. That's sometimes useful for doing some animation in CSS with transitions, as I'll just point out in a second. And then finally, after a default of 20 milliseconds, if you don't set a delay, the main target gets HTMX settling, and any child nodes get HTMX added as classes. And so we can take advantage of this, again, with CSS transitions. So this is something I actually used in this little widget and page that I built. And so this styling, all it says is that we want to look on the page for any HTML elements that have an attribute of data rendered image. And if they have the class of HTMX added, we set their opacity to 0. And so that HTMX added is going to be removed after 20 milliseconds. And so then basically the next rule there in the whole cascade is going to be applied. And it's going to set the opacity to 1. But using transition, it's going to transition from that 0 opacity to a full to an opacity of 1 over 2 seconds. So that allows us to basically fade something in. I just mentioned this because could be useful in your Apostrophe projects. HTMX has a long list of events that it emits when different things occur. All of those events can be listened for in a standard JavaScript add event listener. I should point out that there's also some helpers that aid you, so you don't have to use an add event listener to listen for those events. But in this case, I'm using an add event listener. I'm adding it to the body and listening for HTMX load. So basically, that's just going to cause this to fire when a new element is loaded onto the page. And what I'm passing it here is one of the Apostrophe utility methods, run players. And what that's going to do is, for instance, if you're adding a new widget onto the page and you have some widget player that should be initialized for that new content, this utility function will reinitialize your JavaScript widget players and make sure that those are registered so that they're reactive. Another really great event that is emitted by HTMX is config request, listed down here at the bottom. This is useful because it allows you to modify any of the AJAX requests before they're sent. So you can add query parameters, you can remove query parameters, and you can alter the headers. This is sometimes important if you're looking at an API endpoint that has some kind of CORS rules that you need to comply in order to get content back. So just one last thing before we jump into some actual code. One thing that you always have to consider whenever you're using AJAX on a page is the fact that you're only updating small bits of the page. And so that's not going to be automatically added to the browser history. But HTMX has an attribute to help you with that. The HX push URL attribute, if that's set to true, is going to take a snapshot of the current state of the page. So that's going to include any changes that were made by Ajax. It's going to push that to the browser history. So that way, when the user decides 2 or 3 clicks in that they want to go back to some content that they saw before, they can just use the browser navigation. So that's something that actually used to be kind of painful. It's getting better now, but when Ajaxifying a pain. Okay, so use case. Why would you want to use this in an Apostrophe project? So simply use case, we want to fetch data from an API to display on our page. So this works really easily if we control the API. We can just return markup like was shown in the blog article. So basically, in that case, we're taking advantage of the built-in Apostrophe CMS server-side rendering to deliver new content back to the page so we can do infinite scroll or load more. So this brings us to a caveat that, and I should show that. So basically here, the way Antonella did that in the article was he fired a GET request to a very standard endpoint, just the blog. He's asking the blog to send more pages of data. And I encourage you to take a look at his article if you want to learn more about the show, how he implemented the show only list to limit what data was updated on the page, as well as both his article and the documentation to learn more about APOS refresh, because that's an interesting little flag that or little query parameter you can add to your endpoints. But the issue here, or the caveat, is that HTMX is expecting that whatever it gets back can be swapped into the DOM. So this is all well and good when we're returning markup. But if we don't control the API and we're getting JSON back, then we've got a little bit of a problem. We have to somehow get that JSON massaged over into markup that we can add to our page. And truthfully, there's a number of different ways we could do this in Apostrophe. I picked two. There's more ways, and maybe even ways that are better that we could discuss if people want to learn more. Okay, so before I dive into the code section, I just want to quickly look at what we're getting back from the API we're hitting. So I'm actually using the NASA image asset API here to get pictures back. These are just from a large archive. Unfortunately, not all astrophotography, which is what I was hoping, but pictures of astronauts, things like that. Anyway, this is what the JSON looks like when we get it back. So I filtered it down. It sends back these collections. This is narrowed down to just one collection being returned. And you can see that it's got a data array and a links array. And the data that we want, or the information that we want, is located in the first object within each of those arrays. And we're just going to pull out the title, the description, and the URL for that image in order to sort of in order to set up display of these images on our website. So switching over. So I have two different things that I built out here. One is a page type and the other is a widget. So let's look at the page type first, and one way that we can potentially work with the JSON that's being sent back to us from that endpoint. So looking in the index, this is a plain as you can get page. I'm not adding any extra schema fields at this point. Obviously, in your own projects, you might want to do that. But looking in the views, we've got a couple things going on. So first off, in order to use HTMX, you have to get it onto your page or into your project in some way. So you can load it in from an NPM package. I found that for some reason in my hands, that was a little bit hit or miss. So instead, what I'm doing here is I'm just taking a pretty standard page template and I'm adding this extra head block. I'm adding in super in order to not nuke anything else that's in that extra head. So if something else in some other um, module in your project is adding some extra head information. You don't want to get rid of that. And then I'm bringing in from the CDN the HTMX code from the unpackaged CDN. So this first approach, what I'm doing is I'm taking advantage of an extension for HTMX called client-side templates. And that allows you to actually embed a template on your page that will be filled out by the response from your request. And this supports several nunchucks-like languages. I know it supports Mustache as well. I elected to use nunchucks because I like nunchucks and I kind of understand nunchucks. So I'm also importing from the same CDN nunchucks to be able to translate our template. So next, jumping down from the extra head block, we've got a main block, a little bit of markup here. And then right here, starting with this div hx-ext, that's where we're specifying that everything below or enclosed within this div should use the client-side templates extension. Next up, we've got an HX get request that's being fired by HTMX. And it's actually not hitting the NASA endpoint. Notice it's hitting an endpoint that is within our Apostrophe CMS page. I'm going to go back. It's called fetch NASA image. I'm going to go back and look at this in just a second. But moving on to the next attributes here, the trigger, the HX trigger is going to cause a hit or a request to the API when the element first is loaded onto the page, and then every 10 seconds after that. Obviously, this is pretty fast. You probably want it a little slower on a normal page, but I wanted to be able to see it in the demo. It's going to target a element with an ID of result, which is right down here. It's going to swap the inner HTML, so it's going to add all the code that comes back or all the markup that comes back inside of this outer div. And then finally, this is the new one here that's for the extension. We're specifying we want to use nunchucks, and this is where the template is. And in this case, it directly takes an ID of the template. You don't have to add a CSS selector. So next thing down, one thing that we have to think about is that Apostrophe is going to want to render on the server side any kind of content coming in. So if we just open this up, we need to put our new template, our new nunchucks template inside a raw block in order to get Apostrophe just to pass it through to us, or nunchucks just to get it pass it through to us. And then everything in here is pretty simple. So I'm just grabbing, again, the first object out of the links array, the first object out of the data array, parsing that out to add the title, the URL, and the description in. So now with this done, we can switch over to our window here. I already have a project spun up. Add page. Save that draft. Let's try and nuke this and create a new one. Maybe it'll be happier now. I hope. Okay, there we go. I have no idea what got that all confused. But now you can see it nicely, when we first open the page, loads in an image, and hopefully it's been about 10 seconds, and hopefully nothing goes wrong, and it should change, and it's not, because of course not. Best laid plans. At any point, that should reload every 10 seconds. And I was going to tout the fact that, reloading one more time. I was just going to tout the fact that, we did this all very easily without any kind of extra JavaScript having to be added on. Let's just jump back to the code now. So two things. One, let's first take a look. Let's first take a look at the endpoint that we're actually hitting. So again, scrolling up, We're hitting an endpoint that I added into the Apostrophe CMS page module. So that's up here. And let's take a look at what that does. So this looks kind of complicated, but basically it's just a standard API routes configuration. It's expecting a GET request and hits at this particular name. And basically the NASA API doesn't have a random function. So I'm just created one. So I asked it for a random page. I'm fetching that random page. I'm adding a page size of 10 and selecting one image from those 10 that are returned. And then that's sending the whole thing back over. So right now, I know you might be saying, and if the auto load every 10 seconds had been working, you might have less doubts, but you might be saying, well, why do this instead of just using something like an async component or something like that? And the reason why is, hopefully, we're again crossing our fingers here. We can take this div and let's go ahead and switch it to outer HTML. This is going to end up, make this small. That'll end up completely replacing this with our returned markup. So we're going to do that. And we're also going to take away this every 10 seconds, which we should have seen it reloading the page every 10 seconds. I'm not quite sure why it wasn't. But then what we can do is we can take this same div and we can go to the end of our raw block and we can make two changes. We can say right here at this end of this section, we're going to go ahead and paste that in. And we're going to change the trigger from load to revealed. And then the other thing we're going to do is, probably don't need to do this, but I'm going to anyway. We're going to change this to more results. And then again, we're going to put a div with an ID. What we're going to do here is we're going to trigger an inception. Oops. So every time we get markup returned, it's going to re-add the potential GET request, and it's going to add a new div where we are going to want to put our request. So let's go ahead and save this, and we're going to try once again. So now if we do, there we go. So now when we do our refresh, what we can see is that because there's not like a spacer or something like that, our second image loaded really immediately upon page load. But as we scroll down, we can see that more and more images will load. So that's actually going to take a bit of work, a bit of JavaScript to implement with just an async component. So let's just very quickly, I'm almost to the end here, switch back into the code and look at the widget. So the widget, basically everything's going to be almost identical, except that instead of using an API route, we're going to use a render routes configuration method here. And it's exactly the same thing. Basically, it's expecting a GET request. It's a named method that's going to grab a random page and return our overall object. The only difference here is that in addition to the widget HTML that makes the call out to the fetch, we are also going to need to include the actual HTML template that's going to get sent back. So in this case, you're doing the rendering of the HTML server side and slotting it in using HTMX, and you don't have to have the template being hard coded in sort of in your front end template. So I hope that's fairly clear. And this one I've already constructed. It's already got the extra div down here. And one thing that I just wanted to point out is here I have a trigger and I have a swap, but I don't have a target. So what that's going to do is this outer HTML is going to replace this entire request element with a new section of template. All right, so that is all I have to share for now, and I'm not going to invoke the coding gods to try showing you the widget in case it doesn't work. It's just easier to let you believe that, yes, it would work. Sorry, I went a little bit longer than I expected. Bye-bye.